So tell me, sweetheart, if you're so smart, where should I put $10 million next quarter? Ethan Caldwell's voice cut clean through the low hum of crystal glasses and muted jazz, sharp enough to turn heads without ever rising in volume, the kind of control only someone used to owning rooms could wield. A few of his associates chuckled before the words even landed, already anticipating the punchline, already certain of the outcome. Naomi Brooks stood at the edge of the table, a polished tray balanced in her left hand, the weight of 4 water glasses steady despite the subtle tremor in her wrist. The private dining room glowed in warm amber light, reflections sliding across marble surfaces and tailored suits, every detail curated to signal power, money, certainty. And right in the middle of it sat Ethan, leaning back in his chair like the night itself belonged to him, one arm draped lazily over the leather, a half-smile playing on his lips as he watched her. He didn't need to say it out loud. Everyone at the table understood the game. Naomi was not supposed to answer. She was supposed to smile politely, maybe laugh if prompted, and step away. That was the script. That was the role assigned to someone in her uniform, someone carrying trays instead of portfolios. The man across from Ethan swirled his drink, eyes flicking toward Naomi with mild curiosity, like observing an experiment already concluded. Go on, Ethan added, tilting his head slightly, his tone softer now, but no less loaded. You look like you're thinking. Another ripple of laughter, quieter this time, more controlled, but still there. Naomi's gaze dropped briefly to the table, not in submission but in calculation, her eyes scanning the open tablet beside Ethan's plate where graphs and projections glowed faintly beneath the dim lighting. Numbers, ratios, timelines, familiar patterns disguised as casual display. The kind of information most people in the room would never notice unless it was presented to them in a boardroom, framed with authority. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tray, the cool metal pressing into her palm, grounding her. Somewhere behind her, a server moved past with a whisper of fabric, the scent of seared steak and aged wine hanging in the air, but the space around Naomi felt suddenly narrower, quieter, like everything had pulled inward to this one moment. Ethan watched her closely now, his amusement sharpening into something more focused, as if he'd just realized she wasn't immediately retreating. What's the matter? He said, tapping the edge of the tablet with a single finger. Too complicated? The question hung there, light and casual on the surface, but edged with something colder underneath. Naomi lifted her eyes. Not quickly, not defiantly, just enough to meet his gaze. The room didn't freeze, not exactly, but something shifted, subtle and almost invisible, like the air pressure changing before a storm. Her voice, when it came, was calm, steady, and completely out of place for the role she was supposed to play. That depends, she said quietly, her tone even, measured, as if she were answering a real question instead of a setup. Ethan's smile didn't fade, but it paused, just for a fraction of a second, the smallest interruption in his rhythm. Around the table, a few people leaned in without realizing it, their attention tightening, curiosity replacing amusement in ways they couldn't quite explain. Naomi shifted the tray slightly, the glasses barely clinking, her eyes flicking once more to the screen beside him, absorbing, confirming, calculating. Then she looked back at Ethan, not challenging him, not apologizing either, just present in a way that didn't match the expectations built into the room. It depends, she repeated softly, on whether you're trying to grow it or hide the risk. The silence that followed wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, stretching just long enough to be felt, just long enough for the first hint of something unfamiliar to cross Ethan Caldwell's face. Naomi did not move after the words left her mouth, and for a brief second, it felt as if the entire room had forgotten how to continue. The soft clink of glassware from the main dining area seeped faintly through the closed doors, but inside, everything narrowed to the space between her and Ethan Caldwell. He leaned forward slightly now, the casual posture slipping just enough to reveal attention, not yet respect, but something closer to it than before. His fingers rested near the edge of the tablet, no longer tapping, no longer performing. One of the men at the table cleared his throat, shifting in his chair as if to reset the atmosphere, but the moment had already changed shape. Naomi adjusted the tray in her hand, lowering it just a fraction, her shoulders relaxed but her focus precise, like someone who had already stepped past the point of turning back. She did not rush to explain herself. She did not soften her statement. Instead, her eyes drifted once more to the screen, catching the edge of a projected growth curve that climbed too cleanly, too confidently, the kind of line that looked convincing until you understood what had been left out. Ethan followed her gaze this time. Not fully, not openly, but enough that the connection between her words and his data became impossible to ignore. "That is a bold assumption," he said finally, his voice measured, the hint of amusement still there but thinner now, stretched tighter than before. Naomi shook her head slightly. "It is not an assumption," she replied, her tone even, almost gentle, as if correcting a detail rather than challenging a man. "It is in the structure." The word structure lingered in the air, unfamiliar in that setting coming from someone in her position. A woman seated 2 chairs down leaned closer to the tablet, her brow tightening as she scanned the figures again, slower this time. Another man reached for his phone, his thumb moving quickly across the screen, pulling up something to cross-check. The shift was subtle, but it spread, quiet and deliberate, like a ripple moving outward from a single point. Ethan's expression did not harden, but it changed. The easy confidence that had filled the space around him a moment ago pulled inward, concentrating. "Explain," he said, not as a joke this time, not as a performance, but as a request he had not planned to make. Naomi exhaled softly, the smallest release of tension, and set the tray down on the edge of the table with careful precision, the glasses settling without a sound. Her hands were free now, and for the first time, she gestured toward the screen, not dramatically, just enough to guide attention. "Your projected return assumes stability in the second quarter," she said, her voice steady, each word placed with intention. "But the exposure here," she tapped lightly near a column of numbers, "is tied to a variable you are treating like a constant." The man with the phone stopped typing. The woman leaned even closer. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in dismissal, but in focus. Naomi continued, her tone calm, controlled, as if she had walked through this explanation before, as if the path was already mapped in her mind. "If that variable shifts, even slightly, your downside is not limited the way this model suggests. It compounds." The word landed heavier than the rest. Compounds. It carried weight, implication, consequence. Ethan's gaze moved fully to the tablet now, scanning, recalculating, his mind moving faster than his hands. Around him, the room adjusted again, the earlier laughter replaced by something quieter, sharper. Naomi stepped back half an inch, not retreating, just creating space, her posture still composed, her expression unchanged. She was not trying to win the room. She was not trying to prove anything beyond what she had already said. The light above the table caught the edge of the glassware, scattering reflections across the polished surface, flickers of gold and white that danced without sound. For a moment, no one spoke. And in that silence, the difference between who Naomi was supposed to be and what she clearly understood became impossible to ignore. Ethan did not speak right away, and that alone was enough to shift the balance in the room more than anything Naomi had said so far. His eyes moved across the tablet with a precision that had built his reputation, scanning lines, recalculating assumptions, tracing the path she had pointed out without announcing that he was following it. The confidence that had once filled his posture had not disappeared, but it had tightened, refined into something quieter and far more dangerous than casual arrogance. Across the table, the man with the phone slowly lowered it, his expression no longer amused but intent, while the woman beside him leaned back just slightly, her fingers resting against her lips as if holding back a conclusion she was not yet ready to voice. Naomi remained still, her hands now lightly clasped in front of her, the absence of the tray making her seem somehow more present, more grounded, as though she had stepped fully into a space she had never been meant to occupy. The soft glow from the overhead lighting caught the edge of her uniform, the fabric simple, unremarkable, and yet completely at odds with the clarity of her words. Ethan finally exhaled, slow and controlled, and lifted his gaze to meet hers again, this time without the earlier edge of mockery. "You are suggesting that the entire risk profile is mispriced," he said, each word deliberate, as if testing the weight of the idea before allowing it to settle. Naomi did not rush to answer. She tilted her head slightly, considering, then gave a small nod. I am saying the model hides it well, she replied, her tone steady, almost neutral, but the distinction mattered. Hides it well. Not a mistake. Not an accident. Something designed, or at the very least, something convenient. A faint shift ran through the group, subtle but unmistakable, as if the implications of that phrasing had landed a fraction deeper than the numbers themselves. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of complexity. He turned the tablet toward himself more fully, scrolling with his thumb now, faster, more focused, diving into sections he had clearly reviewed before but was now seeing through a different lens. The polished surface of the table reflected the movement of his hand, the quick flashes of data sliding past in silent succession. This was reviewed by 3 separate teams, he said, not looking up, the statement carrying more weight than volume. Naomi's eyes did not leave him. Teams can agree on the same blind spot, she answered quietly. The simplicity of the sentence seemed to echo longer than it should have, settling into the space like something undeniable. One of the associates shifted in his chair again, this time not out of discomfort but calculation, his gaze flicking between Ethan and Naomi as if trying to measure which direction the moment would turn. Another reached for his glass but did not drink, the motion stopping halfway as his attention remained fixed on the screen. Ethan's scrolling slowed, then stopped. His finger hovered over a section, unmoving, as if he had found the exact point she had been referring to. For a second, his expression revealed it. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough that the certainty he had carried into the room fractured just slightly at the edges. He leaned back, the leather chair giving a soft creak beneath him, and for the first time since he had spoken that opening question, he looked at Naomi not as a performer in his space, but as a variable he had not accounted for. Where did you learn to see that? He asked, the question direct, stripped of pretense, and far more dangerous than any joke he had made earlier. Naomi held his gaze, her expression calm, unreadable, the faintest trace of something deeper passing through her eyes before it settled again into stillness. By paying attention, she said. The answer was simple, almost disarming, but it carried a quiet weight that did not invite dismissal. Around them, the room remained suspended, no longer entertained, no longer relaxed, but alert in a way that felt unfamiliar, as if something fundamental had shifted without anyone fully understanding when it happened. And in that quiet, Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built his empire on always being the one asking the right questions, realized that for the first time that evening, he did not control the answer. The question lingered in the air longer than it should have, not because it was complicated, but because of who had asked it and who was expected to answer. Naomi felt the weight of every eye in the room without needing to look around, the quiet pressure of expectation shifting into something sharper, more uncertain. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence breathe, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, as if the answer was not something to defend but something already decided. Ethan watched her closely, the distance between curiosity and scrutiny narrowing with each passing second, his earlier confidence now replaced by a focus that cut deeper than any dismissive remark ever could. Paying attention is not a qualification, he said finally, his tone calm but edged again, not mocking, but testing, as if he was trying to place her back into a category that made sense to him. The room adjusted subtly, a few shoulders relaxing just enough to signal that the balance might tilt back in his favor, that the moment could still be reclaimed. Naomi inhaled slowly, the faint rise of her shoulders barely noticeable beneath the soft fabric of her uniform, then exhaled just as evenly, grounding herself in something far steadier than the shifting energy around her. No, she agreed quietly, her voice calm, unshaken. It is not. The agreement caught a few of them off guard, a brief flicker of confusion passing between glances, but she did not stop there. But patterns do not care about titles, she continued, her words measured, deliberate, each one landing with quiet precision. They repeat whether someone important notices them or not. The statement settled into the room with a different kind of weight, not confrontational, not defensive, but undeniable in a way that did not invite easy dismissal. Ethan's eyes held on hers, searching now, not for weakness, but for inconsistency, for anything that might unravel what she had built in the last few minutes. He found none. Instead, he found stillness, and something beneath it that did not match the role she was supposed to play. He leaned forward again, slower this time, his elbows resting lightly on the edge of the table, his attention fully locked in. "Then show me," he said, the words low, controlled, but unmistakably serious. It was no longer a performance. It was a challenge. Naomi did not hesitate. She stepped closer to the table, just enough to reach the tablet comfortably, her movements precise, economical, as if she had done this before, as if the distance between serving and analyzing was not as wide for her as it appeared to everyone else. Her finger hovered for a fraction of a second above the screen before she tapped, bringing up a detailed breakdown that had been buried beneath layers of summary data. Columns expanded. Numbers shifted. The clean simplicity of the earlier display gave way to something denser, more revealing. "Here," she said, her voice steady, guiding rather than instructing. "You are smoothing volatility across these projections." Ethan's gaze followed instantly, his focus sharpening further as he leaned in, his earlier detachment gone completely now. Naomi continued, her tone calm but firm. "It makes the curve look stable, predictable, but the underlying exposure is still there. It is just redistributed." The man with the phone leaned forward again, this time openly, his screen forgotten as he watched the data unfold. The woman beside him adjusted her glasses, her expression tightening with concentration as she traced the same lines Naomi had pointed out earlier. Ethan's hand moved slightly, almost unconsciously, as if he wanted to scroll but stopped himself, choosing instead to let her guide the pace. "If the market shifts even a few percentage points," Naomi added, her finger sliding lightly across the screen to highlight a cluster of figures, "this does not absorb the impact. It amplifies it." The word hung there again, heavier now, backed by visible proof. "Amplifies." The room felt smaller, quieter, the earlier warmth replaced by a cool, focused tension that pressed in from all sides. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition, his mind moving rapidly through implications, recalculating outcomes, reassessing decisions that had felt certain just minutes ago. Naomi stepped back once more, giving him space, her hands returning to a neutral position in front of her, her expression composed, unchanged. She had said what needed to be said. She did not push further. She did not seek approval. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was heavy, deliberate, filled with the quiet realization that something fundamental had shifted, and that the person standing beside the table, in a uniform no one had noticed before, had just altered the direction of a conversation that had once belonged entirely to Ethan Caldwell. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured in small, uneven pieces, like tension slipping through cracks that had not been there a moment ago. One of the associates let out a quiet breath he had been holding. Another shifted forward in his chair, eyes still locked on the numbers, as if looking long enough might make them change. But they did not. They stayed exactly where Naomi had revealed them, sharp and unignorable beneath the polished surface of the model. Ethan remained still, his gaze fixed on the tablet, the reflection of the data flickering faintly across his eyes. For a man who had built an empire on certainty, the realization unfolding in front of him was not loud, not dramatic, but it was precise, and it cut deeper because of that. He reached out slowly, scrolling back through the projections, then forward again, retracing the path Naomi had outlined, testing it from different angles, searching for a flaw that would restore the balance he was used to holding. He did not find one. The man with the phone leaned closer, his voice low but no longer casual. "If that exposure shifts like she is saying, you are not looking at a minor correction," he said, glancing toward Ethan. "You are looking at a cascade." The word landed with weight, reinforcing what Naomi had already implied. The woman beside him nodded faintly, her earlier hesitation gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that settled into her posture. "This should have been flagged," she added, her tone controlled, but the implication clear. The room, once aligned behind Ethan without question, was no longer unified. It was thinking, calculating, reassessing, and that shift was far more dangerous than disagreement. Ethan finally set the tablet down, the soft contact against the table louder than it should have been in the silence. He leaned back in his chair again, but the movement was different now, not relaxed, not dismissive, but measured, as if he were creating distance to see the entire situation more clearly. His eyes lifted from the screen and settled on Naomi once more, holding there, longer this time. "You are stepping far outside your role," he said, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying a new kind of weight, one that did not seek laughter, but authority. The statement hung in the air, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the room might return to its original order, that hierarchy would reassert itself and place everything back where it belonged. A manager appeared quietly near the doorway, drawn by the shift in energy, his posture stiff, uncertain whether to intervene or remain invisible. Naomi felt it, the pressure, the expectation that she would step back now, apologize, restore the comfort that had been disrupted. Her hands remained steady at her sides. She did not look at the manager. She did not retreat. "I am," she said simply, her voice calm, without defiance, without apology. The honesty of it landed differently than resistance would have. It did not challenge his authority directly, but it did not yield to it either. Ethan's gaze sharpened, not in anger, but in evaluation, as if he were recalibrating his understanding of her in real time. "And you believe that gives you the right to question a decision at this table?" He continued, his tone still even, but edged now with something more personal, something closer to pride than performance. Naomi held his gaze, steady, grounded, the noise of the room fading behind the clarity of the moment. "No," she answered quietly, and for a fraction of a second, it sounded like agreement again, like surrender. But she did not stop. "But it gives me the responsibility to say something when I know it is wrong." The words did not rise in volume, but they carried further than anything spoken before, cutting clean through the space between them. The manager at the door froze, uncertain, the associates around the table went still, and even the ambient noise from beyond the room seemed to recede, as if the entire building had leaned in to listen. Ethan did not respond immediately. His jaw tightened just slightly, his fingers resting against the arm of his chair, still, controlled, but no longer entirely relaxed. The power in the room had not vanished, but it had shifted, redistributed in a way that no one had anticipated when the night began. And standing there, in a uniform that marked her as invisible, Naomi Brooks had just made it impossible for anyone in that room to pretend they had not seen it. The room did not move, but something inside it softened, not in comfort, but in recognition, as if the edges of power had been sanded down just enough to expose what was underneath. The manager by the door remained frozen, one hand lightly gripping the frame, unsure whether stepping forward would restore order or shatter it completely. No one gave him direction. No one looked at him. All attention stayed fixed on the space between Ethan Caldwell and Naomi Brooks, where the air felt denser, quieter, heavier with meaning than any raised voice could have created. Ethan's fingers shifted slightly against the armrest, the subtle movement the only sign that the stillness around him was not absolute. He inhaled slowly, the breath controlled, measured, as if recalibrating something internal that had been thrown off balance. The glow from the overhead lights caught the edge of his glass, casting a soft reflection across the table, a flicker of gold that moved with the slightest motion of his hand before settling again into stillness. He did not speak. Not yet. And in that silence, the absence of his voice carried more weight than any command he had given earlier. Naomi stood where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but there was a quiet shift in her presence now, not visible, not dramatic, but real. The tension in her shoulders had eased, replaced by something steadier, something grounded deeper than the expectations placed on her. Her hands rested lightly in front of her, fingers loosely interlaced, no longer gripping the tray, no longer anchored by it. Without it, she seemed less like someone passing through the room and more like someone who had always been capable of standing still within it. The hum of the restaurant beyond the private doors returned in faint layers, distant conversations, soft footsteps, the quiet rhythm of a place continuing its evening as if nothing had changed, even though inside this room, everything had. One of the associates shifted again, slower this time, his chair making the slightest sound against the floor before settling. He looked from Ethan to Naomi and then down at the tablet, as if the answer might still rearrange itself into something more familiar. It did not. The woman beside him exhaled softly, her hand lowering from her lips, her gaze steady now, no longer uncertain. The data had not changed. Only the way it was seen had. Ethan leaned forward again, but this time the movement carried no trace of performance, no hint of control meant for others to witness. It was quiet, deliberate, almost reflective. His eyes dropped briefly to the tablet, then lifted once more to Naomi, holding there, longer than before, searching not for contradiction, but for understanding. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of the earlier edge, carrying something unfamiliar beneath its control. "You said responsibility," he repeated, the word measured, as if testing it in a context he had not considered before. Naomi nodded once, a small motion, but certain. The simplicity of it left no room for reinterpretation. Ethan's gaze drifted for a moment, not away, but inward, as if tracing a line of thought that had shifted direction without warning. The silence stretched again, but this time it was not sharp or tense. It was quiet in a different way, like the pause after something has settled, when the noise of reaction gives way to the weight of realization. The manager at the door slowly released his grip on the frame, his posture easing just enough to signal that whatever had needed to happen had already passed beyond his control. He stepped back half a pace, not leaving, but no longer preparing to intervene. At the table, no one spoke. No one laughed. The earlier ease, the practiced rhythm of power and agreement, had dissolved into something more honest, more exposed. Ethan's hand moved again, this time not toward the tablet, not toward the glass, but resting flat against the table, grounding himself in the present moment. He looked at Naomi once more, and for the first time that evening, there was no attempt to define her role in the room, no effort to place her within a hierarchy that made sense to him. There was only acknowledgement, quiet and unspoken, but undeniable. Naomi did not respond to it. She did not need to. She simply stood there, steady, present, her gaze calm, as the weight of the moment settled fully into the space between them, carried not by words, but by the silence that followed. Ethan's gaze did not leave Naomi, but something behind his eyes had shifted, something quieter and far more significant than the authority he had carried into the room. It was not doubt in the usual sense, not hesitation, but recognition unfolding in real time, the kind that did not announce itself, only settled deeper with each passing second. His hand remained flat against the table, fingers relaxed now, no longer poised to command or dismiss, just present, grounded in a moment he had not anticipated. Around him, the others sensed it too, the subtle fracture in certainty that no one could quite name, but everyone could feel. The man with the phone slowly reached for the tablet again, this time not to check Naomi's claim, but to confirm what Ethan was already seeing, his thumb moving carefully through the data, slower now, more deliberate. "This section," he said quietly, angling the screen just enough for the others to see. "It is exactly what she pointed out." The woman beside him nodded, her voice calm but firm. "It is not just a flaw," she added. "It is systemic. It runs through the entire projection." The words settled into the room with quiet finality, not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to ignore. Ethan exhaled again, slower this time, his shoulders easing just a fraction, not in relief, but in acceptance. He reached for the tablet once more, his movements precise, controlled, and as he scrolled, his expression tightened just slightly, not with resistance, but with clarity. The pattern was there. It had always been there. It had simply gone unquestioned because of who had built it, who had approved it, who had presented it. Authority had masked it. Until now. Ethan set the tablet down again, this time with intention, not as a pause, but as a conclusion to a line of thought that no longer needed testing. He looked at Naomi, and when he spoke, his voice carried something entirely different from before. "You are right," he said. The words were simple, almost understated, but they shifted the room more than anything else that had happened that evening. No one moved. No one spoke. The acknowledgement did not come with justification, did not come with conditions. It stood on its own. Naomi did not react outwardly. Her posture remained steady, her expression calm, but there was a faint softening in her eyes, not pride, not triumph, just a quiet confirmation of something she had already known. Ethan's gaze held hers for a moment longer, then drifted briefly to the table, to the data that had once felt certain and now looked entirely different. This deal, he continued, his tone measured, deliberate, needs to be restructured. Immediately, the associates exchanged quick glances, not in disagreement, but in alignment, the earlier uncertainty replaced by a new, sharper focus. Plans began forming silently, calculations shifting, decisions recalibrating, all of it moving forward from a single correction that had come from the least expected place in the room. Ethan leaned back again, but this time the movement carried no trace of distance, no attempt to reclaim control through posture. It was simply a man adjusting to a reality that had changed. His eyes returned to Naomi once more, studying her, not as a curiosity, not as a disruption, but as something far more significant. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice steady, but stripped of every layer that had once placed him above the question. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "Naomi Brooks," she replied. The name settled into the space between them, clear and unadorned, carrying its own weight. Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if committing it to memory in a way that mattered beyond the moment. Around them, the room began to breathe again, quiet movements returning, glasses lifted, chairs adjusted, but nothing fully returned to what it had been. The shift remained, woven into the atmosphere, subtle but permanent. And standing there, no longer defined by the tray she had set aside, Naomi Brooks had not just altered a decision. She had changed the way the room understood who was allowed to be right. The room did not erupt into conversation after Ethan spoke Naomi's name. It shifted instead into something quieter, more deliberate, as if every movement now carried a new awareness that had not existed before. The low hum of the restaurant beyond the doors returned in faint waves, but inside, the energy had settled into a different rhythm, one shaped not by control, but by acknowledgement. Ethan's gaze lingered on Naomi for a moment longer, not searching now, not testing, just holding, as if confirming something that could not be undone. Then he straightened slightly, not to reclaim authority, but to move forward with it differently. "Stay," he said, the word calm, measured, but unmistakably directed at her. It was not an order in the way he had spoken earlier, not something meant to reinforce hierarchy, but something closer to an invitation that carried weight because of who it came from. A subtle shift passed through the room again, the associates exchanging brief glances, the manager at the door pausing mid-step, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. Naomi did not react immediately. Her eyes held Ethan's for a fraction longer. Then she gave a small nod, not submissive, not hesitant, simply acknowledging the moment for what it was. She did not move closer to the table, but she did not step away either. She remained where she was, present, steady, no longer positioned at the edge of the room. Ethan turned his attention back to the group, his voice regaining structure, but not the same tone it had carried before. "We need to reassess the entire framework," he said, his words precise, focused, the earlier certainty replaced by clarity. Not just the projections, but the assumptions beneath them. The man with the phone nodded quickly, already pulling up additional data, while the woman beside him leaned forward again, her earlier composure now sharpened into action. The conversation resumed, but it was different now, no longer flowing around Ethan, but through the shared understanding that had just been established. Naomi watched quietly, her gaze moving between the tablet and the people around the table, her mind tracking the adjustments, the recalculations, the subtle corrections being made in real time. She did not interrupt. She did not insert herself again. She simply observed, the same way she always had, the same way she had learned to see what others missed. Ethan's voice cut through the discussion again, lower, more controlled. "If we adjust for that exposure," he said, gesturing lightly toward the screen, "what does that do to the second quarter outlook?" The question was directed at the group, but his eyes flicked briefly toward Naomi, just long enough to be noticed, just long enough to acknowledge that the answer now lived in a space that included her. One of the associates began to respond, outlining a revised projection, but his voice lacked the earlier confidence, tempered now by caution. The numbers shifted again on the screen, margins narrowing, timelines extending, the clean curve replaced by something more realistic, more grounded. Naomi's gaze followed the changes, her expression calm, but there was a subtle tightening in her focus, as if she was measuring not just the data, but the way it was being handled. Ethan noticed. It was not obvious, not something anyone else would have caught, but he did. "What would you do differently?" he asked suddenly, the question cutting across the conversation without raising his voice. The room paused again, not as sharply as before, but enough to mark the moment. The associate stopped mid-sentence, glancing toward Ethan, then toward Naomi, uncertainty flickering briefly before settling into curiosity. Naomi did not look surprised. She met Ethan's gaze, steady, grounded, the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning. "I would stop trying to smooth it," she said quietly, "and start planning for it." The simplicity of the answer landed with quiet force, reshaping the direction of the conversation in a way that no complex explanation could have done. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, not dramatic, not performative, but real. "Then that is what we will do," he said. Around the table, the shift solidified, decisions aligning, actions forming, the earlier tension dissolving into purpose. Naomi remained where she was, no longer invisible, no longer misplaced, simply part of a moment that had redefined the room without ever raising its voice. The conversation did not end with a final statement or a clear conclusion. It gradually softened, like a current slowing after a shift in direction, each person at the table moving with a new awareness that no one felt the need to announce. The numbers on the screen had changed, the projections adjusted, the assumptions rebuilt, but the most significant change lingered in something less visible, something that could not be quantified or charted. Ethan sat back once more, not as a gesture of control, but as a quiet pause, his gaze drifting across the table, taking in the people who had once mirrored his certainty and now shared in something more measured, more grounded. The glass in front of him caught the warm light again, a soft reflection dancing across its surface as he lifted it slightly, not to drink, but to hold, the motion slow, thoughtful, as if he were anchoring himself in the moment. Across from him, the associates resumed their work in low voices, their tones focused, no longer driven by performance or assumption, but by clarity. The manager at the door had stepped away entirely now, disappearing back into the rhythm of the restaurant, the need for intervention long gone. Naomi remained where she had been, her presence steady, quiet, her attention no longer fixed on the tablet, but on the space as a whole, as if she were already stepping back into the role the world expected her to return to. She reached for the tray she had set aside earlier, her fingers wrapping around its edge with the same practiced ease, lifting it smoothly without a sound. The simple motion marked a shift, not backward, not into invisibility, but into something she understood better than anyone else in the room, how to move through spaces without needing them to recognize her to remain certain of who she was. Ethan noticed. He did not call out to her immediately. He watched as she adjusted the glasses, aligning them with quiet precision, her movements calm, unhurried, as if nothing about the last few minutes required acknowledgement beyond what had already been said. The room continued around her, the conversation steady, the decisions unfolding, but she no longer stood at its center. She had never needed to. As she turned slightly, preparing to step away, Ethan's voice reached her, not loud, not commanding, just present. "Naomi." She paused, her hand resting lightly against the tray, then turned back, meeting his gaze once more. There was no tension left in the space between them, no performance, no challenge, just a quiet understanding that had not existed before. Ethan held her gaze for a moment, searching not for validation, but for the right words, something that did not come easily to someone used to being certain. "Thank you," he said finally. The simplicity of it carried more weight than anything he had said that evening, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way they were given, without condition, without distance. Naomi gave a small nod, her expression softening just slightly, not with satisfaction, but with acknowledgement, as if the moment had reached its natural conclusion. She did not respond with more words. She did not need to. She turned again, stepping away from the table, her footsteps quiet against the floor, blending back into the rhythm of the restaurant, as if she had never stepped outside of it. Ethan watched her go, the movement slow, deliberate, his gaze following her until she passed through the doorway and disappeared into the warm, ambient light beyond. He did not call her back. He did not try to extend the moment. Instead, he remained where he was, his hands still resting against the glass, his posture still, his thoughts no longer centered on the numbers in front of him, but on something far less tangible. Around him, the conversation continued, the work resumed, but the room felt different now, not because of what had been corrected, but because of what had been revealed. Ethan lowered his gaze to the table once more, the reflection of the light steady now, no longer shifting, and for the first time that evening, he allowed the silence to remain exactly as it was, unfilled, complete, carrying with it the quiet weight of a truth he could not ignore.